Hey, welcome to Central Online. Glad to have you watching. We're in a new series titled Boundaries. And I don't know about you, but do you ever run into people in your life that sometimes are a little difficult to love? I know. It's like, are we allowed to say that? But really, sometimes they're just very difficult to love. Sometimes I think that they're a little bit like a mosquito, right? Like, what's a mosquito do? It lands on you, it bites you, it sucks the life out of you, and sometimes you don't even realize it's happening. And that's kind of what happens a lot of times with, I think, certain people can be in our life and just drain us and drain us and drain us. And sometimes we don't even realize it's happening, and we're like, man, why am I so angry and frustrated? Or why do I feel like I'm lashing out when they're not really doing anything? They're just kind of slowly sucking the life out of you. We're going to look at some of those different people that sometimes are hard to love, and our call as Christians on how to love them. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is people who are control freaks. And I would love to know if you're a control freak. You know, in church, I ask people to raise their hands if they're a control freak. And you know what happens is a few people, as they're sitting there, always reach over and try to grab somebody else's hand and raise it. And it's like, okay, if you're trying to raise somebody else's hand, you might be the control freak, right? How about this? If you consistently tell other people how to drive or when to brake, or tell them what route to take, or when to turn their blinker on, or when to turn their blinker off, you might be a control freak. If you always have to have the remote control in your house, you might be a control freak. If you delete spam email, like, who does that, right? If you delete spam email and you respond to every email within like 2 minutes, you might be a control freak, right? If you don't let other people in the kitchen while you're cooking, you might be a control freak. If you restack the dishwasher after someone else has loaded it, which, okay, guys, there's a right way and a wrong way to load a dishwasher, right? So I get this one. But if you do that, you might be a control freak. If you find yourself starting a lot of sentences with, you should, or you ought to, or you know what you should do, you might be a control freak. If you change the way toilet paper is dispensed in someone else's home, you might be a control freak, right? But there's only one right way to do it. It's over. It's over. I won't listen to anything else. It's over, all right? I took an online test in preparation for this message, and it was about whether you're a control freak or not. And so I took the test. I got a pretty high score, and I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to take this test again. I'm going to alter these results. I took it again. It was still a pretty high score. And then I realized what I was doing. I was trying to control the control test, right? Like, control the test to see if I'm a control person. So obviously I struggle with it. And we can have a little fun with it. We can kind of joke about it. But the reality is that for a lot of people, they've probably been hurt or drained or are being drained by someone who is a little bit of a control freak, right? Sometimes it's people in authority, and they can kind of be abusive with that authority. Sometimes they're malicious with it. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they can be really nice people that just kind of drain you. But what we need to know is if we don't have boundaries with those people, then they're eventually going to be just an emotional black hole that we're just pouring into, and it's never enough. It's like that mosquito. They just go from person to person to person, slowly sucking the life out of people, craving more. And so a lot of times what will happen is if those people don't get their way, they whine and complain and pout, or give you the silent treatment, or stomp, or maybe they talk about you, or they walk to the next person, or you feel like you're always walking on eggshells, and it makes it so challenging to be around. But think about this. So much of the gospel is, as Christians, we're called to love people. Like, so much of the Christian life is measured by how we love people, not by what you know, not by who you know, not by how much you give, or how big your Bible is, or anything like that. So much of the Christian life is measured by how do you love other people? And so how do we love people who are really controlling of us? How do we do it? Like, what's your strategy? What have you done that's working? Or what's not working? Well, if so much of the Christian life comes down to the way we love each other, this is something we got to make sure that we're getting it right. How do we love people who are trying to control us? There's a really cool story in Scripture with Jesus and his followers, and specifically with Peter. And Jesus is very clearly explaining what he must do to surrender to God's will in his life. And Peter, well-meaning, but unintentionally, tries to control Jesus and get him to do what he wants him to do. And so just for context, Jesus is explaining that he's going to suffer and he's going to die, and then he's going to give his life as a ransom for everyone. He's going to save people, and that God's going to raise him from the dead. And Peter's basically like, no, that's not happening. That's not going to happen, right? And it's like Jesus is saying, like, no, this is the will of God, right? This is my purpose. And Peter's like, no, I don't think so. No, not going to happen. Not going to happen. So the story is found in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21. It starts this way. It says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and be raised to life. So he's got his followers, and he's telling them, this is why I was sent here. This is what's going to happen, but God's going to raise me back to life on the third day. And Peter, verse 22, Peter takes him aside and began to rebuke him and said, Lord, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. All right? There's a lot of people who want to control you and control your actions. And one of the things that they're going to do is what you see here. Verse 23, Peter took him aside. Hey, let me just talk to you real quick. Hey, let me just come on over here. They want to isolate you, get you alone so that they can impose their will. And that's what we see happening here. Peter pulls Jesus aside so he can tell Jesus what he's going to do. What did Jesus do when Peter tried to manipulate him? This is what Jesus did. The story goes on, verse 23 here. It says, Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Okay, so we see how Jesus dealt with it. Now back to the main question. How do we love people who are trying to control us? Because it's not easy. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing, the absolute most important thing, the first thing is you have to know what your calling is. Know what you're called to do. If somebody's trying to control you and you don't know your calling, they're probably going to be really good at controlling you, right? Jesus was so clear on his calling. Over and over in scriptures, Jesus would say things about why he was here, what his calling was. He says, I came to seek and save the lost. He says, I did not come for those who are healthy, but I came for those who are sick. He said, I did not come for the righteous, but I came for sinners. He said, I didn't come so other people would serve me. He says, I came to serve them and by giving my life as a ransom for many. Jesus was incredibly, incredibly clear on his calling. He knew why he was here. And that's what he's describing to Peter. I've got to live my life. I've got to suffer. I've got to die. And I'll be raised to life. It's God's purpose. He's going to raise me back. For you to love people who are trying to control you, it starts with you knowing your calling, knowing your purpose. What is God calling you to do? And guys, I think sometimes people think like God's calling is this big, like grandiose, over the top thing. Like I've got to go be a missionary to the moon, and I've got to be a missionary to Middle Earth, and I've got to do all these crazy intense things, and maybe God's calling you to do that, right? But I really think that rather than the heavens opening up and God's voice coming in, hey, something like that, I think a lot of times God's calling is to just do your best right where you're at. Right where you're at. I think we over-spiritualize calling. I really do. I would argue that our calling isn't always something specific. Most of the things in my life that I take a lot of pride in, I am in those roles because I said yes to God in little things. I think about my role as a head football coach. That was never a goal that I sought out for 8 years ago when I started coaching. I was basically just a bus driver. They were desperate for coaches, so they're asking a bus driver to come help coach. And I was like, look, I've not coached football. I was maybe above average as a player, right? But that was years ago. And he's like, that's okay. He's like, we just need somebody who can be a positive influence, right? Just basically be a cheerleader. I was like, okay, I can do that. And I said yes to God. I said yes to that situation, and then I look at it 8 years later where I am. I think about it with foster care. I never really wanted to do it. I worked in a group home, and I was miserable working in that group home. But I just kept saying yes to God with little things. Yes to God about hearing about it. Yes to God about listening about foster care and talking about it. And next thing I know, I'm a foster parent with 2 kids of my own. I think about my role in ministry. Honestly, I wasn't going to school to be a minister. I was going to be a cop. I was going to pull all you guys over who don't use a blinker. Use that blinker, right? I was going to be a cop. That's what I wanted to go into. And on one Wednesday night, Ken asked me to fill in and lead the senior high youth group one night, back when we were meeting in Donatos. One night, and I said, yeah, sure. And here we are, like 15 years later. So I think a lot of times, it's just saying yes to the little things. I think if I could go back to 18 years old and say, hey, 35-year-old Andy, you're going to be a head football coach, a foster father, a biological father, a husband, a preacher, I'd say there's no way. There's no way I can do that. There's no way. But it's just saying yes to little things because they fulfill my calling, right? I don't think God has called me to be a football coach. I don't think God has called me to be a preacher. I think God has called me to be open to following his calling. And this is where it's led me. Your calling probably will lead you to your wife, right, man? Like, I think God's calling in your life is to be an amazing husband to your wife. To love her like Christ loved the church, to be willing to die for her. Guys, I think that your calling is to be a heavenly minded parent. Set the tone in your house. Be different. I love talking to parents who are different from other parents. I think they're following God's calling. Your calling might just be a really good student. Your calling might be in this season of life not to a work, but to a way of life. To be a witness to somebody. So you have to identify your calling. My calling is clear. All right, my top 3 things. I am called to be a loving husband to my wife. I'm called to love her with everything that I've got. I'm called to lead my kids. Lead them to Christ. They're really not my kids. None of them. They're all God's. He's just granted them to me for a little bit. And they are truly a gift from God. And so my calling is to create an environment in my home where they will live for Christ. And I believe my calling is everywhere I go. I want to be a light. I want to be different. I want to be a light. I want to shine the love of Christ everywhere I go. You need to know what your calling is. And I would challenge you to be specific. Write it down. Don't just be like, oh yeah, I know my calling. No, write it down. Number it. Prioritize it. What is your calling? Because the problem is a lot of people are people pleasers. I don't know if you're a people pleaser. I struggle with that from time to time. But it can be a real battle for a lot of people. And what I think we don't realize, if we don't clarify our calling, and if you struggle in any capacity with people pleasing, then essentially what you get pulled into is a form of idol worship. Because you end up caring far more about other people's opinions than you do God's calling in your life. If nothing else, it's like, well, that's what I'm listening to, that's what I'm following, that's what I'm persuaded by, is other people's opinions more than God's calling. And do you see how that can be a problem? Wrongly putting other people's opinions ahead of God's opinion is sinful. It's wrong. And that's what happens when we don't know our calling. Our knowing your calling, defining it, creates clarity. Makes it so much easier to say, no, I'm not spending my time on that. No, I'm not staying for that meeting. No, I'm not taking that phone call. No, I'm not going there. Because I know my calling is to love my wife, to lead my kids, and to be a witness. So what's your calling? Clarify your calling. Right now, I believe God has uniquely positioned each and every one of you to follow his calling somewhere very different from where I could, or from where your spouse could. What has God called you to do? The second thing, after you define your calling, and guys, that's a huge thing, right? How do we love these controlling people? Know your calling. The second thing is understand when someone's trying to control you and acknowledge it. Don't make excuses for them. Acknowledge it. Recognize it and acknowledge it. That's, okay, here's what's going on. You're trying to control me. Understand that and verbalize that. That's what happens in the story, Matthew 16. Jesus basically says, this is what God's calling me to do. I'm going to lay down my life, and God's going to raise me up. And Peter's like, no. That's not going to happen. That's never, ever, ever going to happen. Now ask yourself this. Was Peter the worst person who ever lived? No. In fact, he was a pretty awesome person. Peter was a pretty incredible person. Now ask yourself, did he hate Jesus? No, not at all. Was it his intentional plan to distract Jesus? No, I don't believe it was. He was a good guy who loved Jesus, and he was very heavenly minded. In fact, just moments before this, he won a trivia competition with Jesus. Yeah, you didn't know they had trivia competitions in the Bible, but Jesus asked his disciples just before this, who do other people say that I am? And the disciples are answering, and they're kind of like, well, this person says this, and this person says this, and they kept getting the answer wrong. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter got the answer exactly right when he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter was not an evil man. He wasn't a terrible person. He wasn't a villain. But in this moment, he was putting his own plan ahead of God's plan. And you can see how that's wrong. And people will do that. Well-meaning, loving, caring people that love you and care about you will put their plans for your life ahead of God's plan. Why did Peter try to control Jesus? Because he didn't understand God's plan. Jesus knew his calling. Peter didn't know his calling. It may be a really good person. It may be a really nice person who tries to control you or manipulate you or thinks that they're really trying to help you. But they can be wrong and still be a very loving person. And we see that here. Understand what your calling is. Recognize and acknowledge when something's pulling you from your calling. And the third thing, and this is probably the hardest part of it, truthfully. The third thing, draw the line in the sand. Draw the line in the sand. You have to know what your boundaries are. You have to know how to draw the line in the sand. You have to know when to cut it off. Know when it's time to do that. And that's exactly what Jesus does to Peter, right? This is a type of interaction that many of us would probably try to avoid. But when Jesus says, hey, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die and God's going to raise me to life, and Peter's like, no, that's not